We're here tonight for a program about what happened after the plan. We find ourselves some 15 years after the Plan for Transformation, which is Chicago's implementation of federal policies crafted in the 1990s aimed at deconcentrating poverty. That plan had a profound impact on the city's physical and cultural fabric. After the plan, it's become more difficult to place public housing in the city. What does it look like, public housing, after the towers are gone? And most importantly, where are the people, the residents of public housing? As we answer these questions during tonight's program, we'll be powerfully reminded of a couple of things. One is that the residents of public housing are still very much with us. In fact, without them, there would be no public housing museum. The other is that we need to look harder and think more deeply about the places where public housing residents reside, because it is in these places that our discussions about affordable housing policies unfold. These are places that we will hear are segregated and impoverished, and yet there are other places that are mixed into our suburbs and our new real estate developments. One such place is the last vestige of the Jane Addams homes, which was built as a demonstration of the powerful impact that the government could make in housing, emerging from an optimistic charter of the New Deal era. It's important to remember when you come into our place, which is the future home of the museum, as over 1,000 visitors did during the recent Chicago Architecture Biennial, that it was former residents of that building on Taylor Street and from the entire ABLA community on the Near West Side that insisted on keeping a structure standing that until 2002 contained their homes. The museum builds on their vision of a place where public housing resident stories could be told. We draw inspiration from places like the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side in Manhattan that make visible stories that too often go untold, unseen, and unheard. Over the next few months, at the museum, we'll be finalizing an agreement with the CHA that will enable us to finally begin building our vision. The museum will exist as a permanent forum for resident voices to shape the dialogue that impacts the policy and the cultural values upon which the future of housing will depend. So tonight's discussion, we want to say, is the first really of two parts. We're pleased to announce that we have a commitment from the Quinn Chapel on the south side of Wabash and 23rd Street to host a follow-up discussion with public housing residents on the panel in the spring that continues tonight's dialogue. It will allow further reflection, not only to what happened to the families, but what is happening today in the lives of families in public housing. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of tonight's discussion, Paul Fisher. Paul is the who is evidently a rock star, but also an emeritus professor of politics at Lake Forest College. His involvement in the Plan for Transformation dates to before its inception, beginning with a HUD grant in the 90s, where he inventoried structures in the vicinity of Cabrini Green. Since that time, he has studied and reported on the segregative effects of the plan, looking at where families from high-rises relocated, and at the CHA Service Connector program. Paul is a consultant and housing board member of the Metropolitan Planning Council, Business People for the Public Interest, the Shriver Center, and serves as board chair of Housing Choice Partners of Illinois. Paul will in turn be introducing the phenomenal individuals that we have on the panel that he has organized for this discussion. So with no further ado, let's welcome him, as you already have, and our other panelists, Mary Patillo, Amy Khare, Crystal Palmer, and Chris Klepper. And as one last reminder, to kindly silence your phones.
Oh, I'm so excited about seeing so many people here. It's so wonderful. It just vindicates for me a notion that Chicagoans are very, very interested in what happened with the Plan for Transformation. Let me spend a few minutes explaining why I put this program together under the auspices of the Public Housing Museum. I thought it was time, almost 16 years since the plan's inception. What is the plan? It was part of a federal initiative called Hope 6 to transform public housing primarily through the replacement of the high-rise developments with mixed-income communities and reduce class and racial segregation. The largest effort in the United States was in Chicago, with the highest concentration of high-rise developments in one of the most segregated cities in the United States. The plan is not complete, but enough has been done to look at the effects. The physical impact is obvious. Just walk down State Street from 35th Street to note the disappearance of what used to be the largest numbers of public housing residents in Stateway Gardens and Robert Taylor Homes. Or stroll around north of Chicago and Division, where Cabrini Green stood, to see how the plan has affected real estate. Or south or west of UIC and the United Center, where Abla, Horner, and Rockwell Gardens used to be. The physical effects of the plan for transformation are clear, and for many, or at least for some, prove the success of the plan with new housing and commercial development in a number of sites, areas. But we know less about what has happened to the families who are the plan's priority, to improve their quality of life, to provide safe and healthier environments, to provide an opportunity for upward mobility. Approximately 25,000 households lived in the 38,000 CHA units on October 1st, 1999. Of those, 16,500 households resided in family units. This is the official legal date of the plan's inception. It is the legal date because it was the result of a relocation rights contract with existing families, guaranteeing them certain rights and priorities. How have the families fared? We know a number left the program, and some moved out of the area. We also know that when the buildings were emptied, there were many folks living there who were off lease or squatting in a vacant unit. It was hard to determine how many there were, but I did speak with a number of organizations dealing with the homeless who told me anecdotally that their client load had increased. But for this panel, we decided to focus on the primary groups affected by the plan that we have information about as a way of understanding its impact and potential success. They include families who moved into new mixed-income developments, which was the primary focus of Hope 6 and the Plan for Transformation. Families who took a voucher and were relocated to South or West Side neighborhoods, similar in demography to the high-rise neighborhoods that they came from. Families who took a voucher and with the help of HCP of Illinois and other groups, regional housing counseling agencies, relocated to an opportunity area. And finally, families who moved to traditional public housing in a rehab development like Dearborn Homes. We hope that by examining these 4 different outcomes, it will help us understand both the benefits and the limitations of the Plan for Transformation, one of the most important government housing programs, certainly in the history of Chicago. To aid in this exploration, the National Public Housing Museum is hosting an outstanding panel, including 2 academic researchers, the director of the Housing Counseling Agency that helped families with their relocation, and a member of the museum board who works with the CHA representing public housing families and is familiar with traditional public housing. Each panelist will speak for 15 minutes, and I will keep them to that time limit. Then we will have some time for audience questions and conversation. Just a note before we start. As Todd said, we planned this as the first of 2 panels exploring the plan from its effects on residents. The second panel will be composed of residents themselves, representing these 4 different outcomes, and we hope to, and as Todd said, we are scheduling it in the near future. We'll begin with Amy Khare from the University of Chicago, who will focus on families in the mixed income developments. Amy will graduate in this spring with her PhD at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration, where she currently serves as a lecturer. In 2015, she received an Emerging Scholar Award presented to one doctoral candidate in the nation by the Urban Affairs Association. Amy's scholarship aims to shape solutions to socioeconomic and racial inequality with a focus on policy in the areas of affordable housing, community development, and supportive services. Amy's work has been published in the Urban Affairs Review, Journal of Urban Affairs, and Cityscape, as well as in policy reports designed for various audiences, advocates, and policymakers. Amy?
Thank you, Paul, Todd, and Ann Dodge for hosting this event tonight. It's very exciting to see so many people here. It's clear that this is still a relevant issue that we all must put more attention to. I also want to acknowledge the folks in the audience who I had a chance to interview over the last 7 years that I've been doing this research, as well as families who are here. I want to acknowledge that your experience is unique and your own, and my remarks surely do not mean to represent each and every other individual struggle. Those who went through the relocation process and who secured housing, as well as those of you who still await an opportunity to call home, have much to add to these conversations. I hope my remarks will provide a sounding board in which to frame some of the broader trends facing our city, public housing reforms, and more importantly, the residents. My own experience has been one of an observer and a participant in shaping the plan. I started off working with a group of residents back in 2005 in the North Kenwood, Oakland neighborhood when I was working for Heartland Housing, as residents were moving into one of the first new mixed income developments in the city. And it was there that I first had the opportunity to understand some of the challenging dynamics between owners and renters across different economic differences and racial differences. It was then that I became a research subject and went from being on the one side of research to the other. So I've now spent the last 8 years interviewing people, observing events, reading reports, tracking the monies of the budget of CHA, observing all sorts of public rallies and policy forums. And I really want to thank my colleagues Rob Chaskin and Mark Joseph for the opportunity to work with them on the mixed income development study. I'll be speaking tonight on some of the work that has been published from that is in this new book called Integrating the Inner City. Highly recommend it. For those of you that have not had a copy of it yet, please get one. And I also have some briefs out in the front that I will share for free. So please do take one or get a hold of me. So tonight I want to draw on both that research as well as a 16-month ethnography that I've been conducting that focuses on CHA's policy shifts in the post-recession context and its impact for Chicago. This work has entailed interviewing 61 different government officials, developers, financial investors, foundation representatives, as well as advocates and activists who want to ensure that the right to housing remains on the forefront. In fact, some of you are here tonight, so I thank you for granting me interviews, and I wouldn't have been able to do this without you, so thank you. Mixed income strategies have been probably the most controversial part of the plan for transformation, in part because of their underlying assumptions that place social contact and connection in the forefront of the strategy for addressing poverty. This is not a new debate. As the nation, we've always struggled to decide who is deserving and who's not, to place blame on citizens who do not, on their own or even with assistance, reach an ideal of economic success. But these strategies are even more contested in these types of public housing reforms because of the transition in the role of government and the turn towards the private market. So I want to start by suggesting that there are a range of perspectives on what these strategies are intended to achieve and by what means and for whose benefit. In the short time I have, I'm going to address 3 questions tonight. First, how did residents living in and around the new mixed income developments experience their own social dynamics? This is a question that is mission-driven or social in mind. The second question is, how did these developments, and by extent the residents living in them, experience the market or the economic goals of the plan? The recession and its continued aftermath creates an extensive challenge, and the response by policymakers have been, well, let's just say, not good enough. Then I pose a set of issues for further action. Before I go into that, a short, quick overview on the plan for transformation. So this is the policy context. We know that in 1999, the city went into a time of excitement and hope with lots of positive intention around what was to come. Mayor Daley, as well as many officials at the federal level, helped to create a new way for us to think about deconcentrating poverty. There were two major policy agendas. One was a dispersal strategy that seek to get people out of inner city poor neighborhoods and into new opportunities. The second is a redevelopment strategy, and that's the one I'll be focusing on tonight. So one question with this is, are these reforms that are national in their intent, how are they aimed to catalyze urban redevelopment and new housing? How do they provide incentives to the market sector actors like real estate developers, property management companies, and also banks and financial institutions? And how do they do that through the model of mixed income development, which is about spatial integration? It's about recreating the built environment. So for what purpose? The purpose, is it for alleviating poverty through social integration, or is it about reclaiming urban neighborhoods for the affluent? These are part of the debates that have long been had about this strategy and that still continue to exist. So for Chicago's plan, you can see the difference between our 1999 plan and our 2013. I think we've gone through 3 different CHA branding campaigns during that period with new logos. So it's evolved, and we've seen lots of investment, over $3.5 billion, and a plan to create 25 new or rehabbed units, but that also entailed a loss of 14,000 public housing units. And the idea was, with that loss, we would replace them with vouchers. This strategy also meant privatizing ownership of land and services, and it also involved a local control through federal deregulation and decentralization, so that rather than HUD officials making decisions, local officials now had power. And of course, we have the legal context of the Gautreaux case. It also happened through an amazing extent of public-private partnerships. Many of you are in the room who represent those public-private partners. It took a lot of effort on the part of many sectors to make this happen. It also took a lot of money. The private sector invested bonds, tax credits, subsidies, and land through the public sector, equity and loans through the private. So where are the original families now? The last report from 2011 from the CHA does show some effort to land final permanent housing, and yet 44% of the original population is still not in a permanent choice housing. So it does have some momentum and also not necessarily where we had hoped to go. Just to give you a contrast of the plan in 1999, the extent to which they had envisioned this being primarily a rehab strategy through low-rise, scattered site, and senior housing, with a portion of that, about 10,000 units for redevelopment. And you can see the units delivered in 2015. We've hit 89% towards the 25,000, and that's how the plan, in terms of its benefits, have been allocated. I'm sorry, I'm realizing I'm a slide below. That's the slide I was pointing to, so you can see that. Once your left side is the intent, in 1999. That was the plan. And your right side is what happened. So we've got about 22,000 units that have been developed, 89% completed, and yet we had some change in strategy in that the mixed income units that were predicted to happen did not, and I will talk through why that happened. So in terms of social dynamics, what have we learned? We've learned that we've definitely seen a change in the physical environment, so much more safe environments in and around these mixed income public housing sites, and residents have expressed decreased stress and an increased peace of mind. We've seen increased social interaction within the same group, but low levels of interaction across different income groups. And in fact, we've also seen negative interactions, mostly around small minor annoyances, around kind of rules and norms, but also some that have been pitched in ways that have led to stronger tension, particularly that has focused on race. We've seen an effort to try and build organic communities. It's an idea that these could become naturally existing places where people could integrate across different groups, both within the development and also in the neighborhood. We've seen some issues around public control, or public space and social control, around norms of behavior and rules, residents feeling targeted, that there have been double standards applied, and that community space has not necessarily always been a safe space. We've seen residents who have not necessarily had a voice or a space at the table, and certainly not enough governance mechanisms in place to ensure fair and equitable participation and deliberation in the decision-making processes. So the social dynamics are intense, and us versus them social dynamic has existed in many of these communities, and it's one that still has opportunity for change. In terms of the market dynamics and the post-recession realities, we can see that the plan was going as planned up until about the recession, and in 2007, a strong drop in the number of units being built. In the public housing particularly, we were not able to achieve the goal that we had set out to achieve. And there are many reasons for that. One is definitely economic in nature, in that it takes private sector developers and investors to be willing to invest in these communities. If they're not there and they're not willing to put their money in, then we cannot make this strategy happen. What we also see is a new way of thinking about the vacant open land that's available. CHA has shifted both in terms of their explicit goal in the plan forward, as well as in their more informal communication about what is the best use of land, moving from housing to a different way of thinking about land use being commercially focused around recreation, art centers, and also even more explicit commercial uses such as Targets and Mariano's. We all want one of those, right? And this just gives you an idea of just in terms of the visual space of how much land we're talking about. It's 208 acres around the city. That's about 58 football fields of vacant open land that is currently being debated and sometimes planned, other times ignored. So this site in particular, that old Ida B. Wells, is a site where we've seen the most housing developed. So this is our greatest our vision of success in terms of actual units built. And yet you can see in purple the lack of housing or the lack of community space that's been created. So we're very much still in a time of change. So as part of this post-recession context, we've also known that there's been a rising demand in housing. The Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard shows 1 in 4 residents around the country are seeking affordable housing and paying more than 50% of their income towards rent. Here in Chicago, what that looks like is that in 2014, when CHA opened their list again, 280,000 residents of the city registered. They took 120 of those on a wait list, and that wait list is moving very slowly because there's very few options for the residents currently living in any of these units, and so very little turnover. So in terms of CHA's current progress, they've got a lot of capital funding available, $22 million in reserves as of 2015. So we do have the capacity in Chicago to be able to build new housing in these communities or in other communities. But we have seen a level of redevelopment that's been stalled. 53 units were built last year. I have high hopes for the new CEO and the new team he has brought on that we will be able to get more units built in 2016. But yet, we still have challenges. Our vouchers are also not being utilized to the level that they need to be. So to end, I want to suggest that it's time for a call to action. We had a lot of momentum going. We had people who were committed to housing and community development, and yet that has transitioned. Instead, what we're seeing is social movement organizing and activism around criminal justice issues, around racial and economic inequality in a much broader sense. We've seen people be able to shut down Michigan Avenue. We've seen hunger strikes taking place in our city for a call for better schools. Is it possible for those of us that still care about housing and affordable housing and community development to actually get into these discussions, to be a part of these movements in order to create a more socially just society? I hope that you'll be with me on that movement. There's work to be done. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Mary Patillo, Northwestern University, who will focus on families who relocated to the south and west sides of Chicago. Mary Patillo is the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Black Middle Class and Black on the Block, The Politics of Race and Class in the City, which focus on class stratification, public housing, crime, urban planning, community organizing, and youth culture in African American neighborhoods in Chicago. She is the co-editor of Imprisoning America, The Social Effects of Mass Incarceration. She holds a master's and a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago and a BA in urban studies from Columbia University. Before she begins, I just want to mention that a number of years ago, I did a study tracking the public housing families with vouchers, the ones that were relocated. Over 90% ended up in highly segregated and impoverished communities in the south and west sides of the city. The study became the basis for a civil rights lawsuit brought by the Sargent Shriver Center against the CHA, which was eventually settled out of court. So I just remember that in the context of Mary's comments. Mary?
Thanks, everyone, for coming into the National Public Housing Museum for putting together this important event. The 29th, is there somewhere I should, well, I'll just leave Amy's up there. I don't have a PowerPoint,
Actually, you can forward it. I think
it's fine.
Okay.
I think it's fine. The 29th Ward Alderman in Austin told my research assistants in the early 2000s, quote, "The Austin area has a disproportionate number of Section 8 voucher holders, some 2,588. I don't envision my ward taking any more vouchers, as we have taken on more than our fair share." This sentiment about fair share was echoed throughout the interviews we did in 8 Chicagoland communities that could have been the destination neighborhoods of families moving out of the demolished public housing buildings. A resident of South Shore told us, quote, "It's institutional irresponsibility or lack of responsibility that undermines middle-class Black areas like South Shore. Are they going to be inundated with Section 8? You can't continue to put all the poor in one place. It hurts the community, hurts the families. Someone needs to go to affordable towns, to suburbs so rich in resources and opportunity. What have they done to do their fair share in the city? They get off scot-free all the time. Big tax base, best schools. A resident of South Suburban Harvey echoed, quote, "What we say in Harvey is we don't mind Section 8. We just want everybody else to take their fair share of Section 8 tenants too. We don't want a concentration of the underprivileged in any given area in anywhere in Cook County. We just say spread it out so it will be balanced." Even in the North Shore suburb of Evanston, where only 1% of the housing units at that time received any kind of public subsidy, city leaders made comparisons to neighboring suburbs that had no subsidized housing. A representative of the Evanston Human Relations Commission said, quote, "There are already 900 Section 8 voucher holders in Evanston. The Human Relations Commission is trying to decentralize that concentration of housing assistance voucher families, but not limit the total number of public housing families. Because space is so limited in Evanston, and because no new affordable housing is being built, the Housing Authority of Cook County is looking to place Section 8 holders in other regional areas, like Skokie, Wilmette, Kenilworth. I think it's time that these areas did their part too and began accepting Section 8 families." So let me put this in context. There are roughly 40,000 families in Chicago with vouchers, and at most 5,000 of that number are families who have been moved out of the demolished public housing units. This is Chicago, 2.7 million people. There are over 1 million total housing units in the city. This means that families with vouchers live in 0.04% of all housing units, and relocated public housing families live in 0.005% of all housing units in Chicago. And of course, if we consider all of the housing units in the Chicagoland 6-county metropolitan area, we'd be talking about an even more infinitesimal percentage. Even if we just consider the rental housing in Chicago, all families with vouchers make up 0.07% of renter households, and relocated public housing families make up 0.008% of renter households. So while the cries of fair share may be unwelcoming, discriminatory, stigmatizing, and harsh, the then alderman of the 7th Ward in South Shore was mathematically correct when she said, quote, "Chicago is large enough for the city's poor to be spread out so that no one community is responsible for supporting the majority of them." My research over the decades concludes that it's not the math that's wrong, it's the word them at the end of her sentence. That's the problem. It's that labeling and that stigmatizing that cuts widely across all kinds of Chicago and suburban communities, and indeed across the country. And it is that perception that poor people generally and public housing residents leaving the demolished projects have to deal with when they move to new neighborhoods. Of course, this goal of evenly spreading out poor families doesn't take into account where displaced public housing families themselves would like to live. And it doesn't take into account where they are constrained to live, given how much rent the voucher will actually pay, the availability of family-sized rental units, the receptiveness or not of landlords, and the accessibility of public transportation. So I'm not suggesting that a perfectly even distribution is attainable or even desirable, as you'll hear in my closing remarks. But it is what people out there in the neighborhoods that are talking about fair share are talking about. So there are 5 streams of research that relate to the neighborhoods where displaced public housing residents might move. There's general descriptive studies, research on Hope 6 spillover effects, research on the effects of subsidized housing on property values in nearby neighborhoods, research on the effects of new public housing and voucher families on crime rates, and my own research on the perceptions and reception of public housing families and voucher families and renters and poor people more generally in those destination neighborhoods. I'll say a little bit about each of these 5 streams, a little bit. So the research about where former public housing families have moved is what Paul just mentioned in his opening remarks. It's quite consistent. As Deidre Oakley and Carrie Birchfield summarize in their findings in Chicago, quote, relocated public housing residents are far more likely to end up in highly disadvantaged neighborhoods where voucher housing is spatially concentrated. Indeed, relocated families are not distributed throughout the city of Chicago, but instead are concentrated in poor Black neighborhoods on the south and west sides of the city. The Chicago Housing Authority spins it a little differently, writing in its 2011 report, quote, today looking at all original family housing residents in CHA developments and in the private market with CHA vouchers, these residents live in 75 of the 77 community areas, end quote. Well, this is also true, but that includes the 2 relocated families in Archer Heights, the 1 relocated family in Edison Park, the 1 relocated family in Mount Greenwood, and I could give others. 17 community areas, or nearly a quarter of Chicago's communities, had fewer than 10 relocated families. Meanwhile, in many neighborhoods on the south side, between 10 and 15% of all rental units are subsidized with a voucher, not relocated public housing families, but subsidized with a voucher, including Washington Park, Woodlawn, South Shore, Burnside, Chicago Lawn, West Englewood, West Pullman, and Auburn Gresham. Similarly, in her research on families with vouchers moving to Chicago suburbs, Adrienne Holloway writes, quote, study findings show that HCV households were more likely to move to suburban communities characterized as largely rental communities with high numbers of African American households, of people living in poverty, and of people receiving public assistance. So we see that the landscape of where public housing residents and families with vouchers more generally are moving is clear across studies, dating from Paul's research to more recent studies. But this line of research isn't really about how the destination neighborhoods themselves are affected by new residents. So the second line of research is about how Hope 6 has spillover effects on property values and other characteristics of nearby neighborhoods. So the Hope 6 neighborhood, but also the neighborhoods that surround it. And it either finds no impact of no spillover effects, or a positive impact of Hope 6 on nearby neighborhoods in terms of housing values, increased property and sales taxes paid, reduced crime, and other measures. And I think some of Amy's research has pointed to that. So an early analysis of the effect of the Horner, Abla, and Robert Taylor Hope 6 projects found, not surprisingly, that average household income and housing values in the surrounding neighborhoods increased dramatically. Around Horner, for example, the household income increased 115%, and the property values increased 215%. But these impacts are likely because of the fact of the affluent newcomers moving in rather than the improving situation of the people who had lived there before. Third, there is research on the effects of a range of subsidized housing on neighborhood property values and other neighborhood characteristics. So in interest of time, I'm not going to say much about this, and I'm going to condense it and basically say there is definitely no conclusive evidence that the in-migration of low-income households has uniformly negative impacts on neighborhoods, as many people fear. My property values are going to go down, people are going to want to leave. And indeed, there are often positive effects of things like low-income housing tax credit units, project-based Section 8, and other kinds of subsidized housing. Research stream number 4. A big debate kicked off in 2008 in response to an Atlantic magazine article entitled, quote, American Murder Mystery, which blamed displaced public housing residents and voucher residents as the cause of rising crime in the suburbs of Memphis, Tennessee. Lots of researchers got in the game of studying this. In Chicago and Atlanta, Sue Popkin and her colleagues asked the question, quote, are neighborhoods that were the destinations for families relocated from demolished projects in Chicago and Atlanta experiencing increasing crime? What they found was more complicated than a simple yes or no answer. Crime went down in most of the destination neighborhoods of displaced public housing residents. But the authors estimated, because this was a time when crime was going down in the city overall, the authors estimated that crime would have gone down even more if those relocated public housing families had not moved in. In other words, relocation stunted the crime decline in neighborhoods that received large numbers of public housing residents. The greater the proportion of relocated families within the neighborhood, the greater was the impact on crime. Furthermore, while this study found a correlation between dense concentrations of public housing families and slower crime drops, another study by the same team of authors found no association between violent crime and housing voucher holders more generally, now not just public housing residents, but housing voucher families more generally. But they did find that, quote, growth in HCV holders is positively associated with growth in property crime rates. However, only in higher poverty neighborhoods or if HCVs exceed a threshold concentration. So in many ways, they are raising this issue of fair share by talking about a threshold concentration. But I'm going to come back to this idea of threshold because I think it contributes to the kind of stigma and marginalization that I've been talking about. So finally, I have done a few studies over the years on reactions of residents in receiving neighborhoods to newcomers of all sorts. In the early, is that 3 or 1? Okay, good. In the early 2000s, I worked with a team of grad students to interview people in Uptown, Rogers Park, Austin, Bridgeport, South Shore, Evanston, Harvey, and Calumet City. We found that these neighborhoods were overwhelmingly resistant to accepting subsidized renters. Every community we studied, whether well-off or poor, black or white, suburban or urban, reported that had more than its fair share of low-income residents using housing vouchers. And of course, this was in the early 2000s, really before the plan for transformation had gotten underway. My more sustained ethnographic research has been in a black middle-class neighborhood on the south side that I call Groveland. I give it a pseudonym so that the people would speak to me freely and I could hold their confidence in their anonymity. I published Black Picket Fences in 1999, and the rhetoric among residents of Groveland was already mentioning Section 8 renters even before the plan for transformation had begun. I went back to the neighborhood in 2012 to follow up with those families I had interviewed in the 1990s, and there remained a salient narrative of blaming poor people for community problems. Tyson Reed, for example, talked specifically about the influx of public housing families, saying, quote, when they moved into some of those communities, talking about Groveland and the areas that surround it, you almost had a version of black flight, not white flight, but black flight. So now you take out people who care about their cars, and now you got people walking down the street busting windows, you got people who, kick in people's doors, all that type of thing. So what's going to happen to that community? It's going to go in the toilet. At least that's what I think. People associated displaced public housing residents, Section 8 residents, and renters with lower property values, declining property upkeep, and an increase in crime. When I talked about foreclosure with people, all they could talk about was that the vacant homes would become the houses of Section 8 residents. Nisha Morris told me, quote, it's not even really the foreclosures, because now it's so many houses available, I think about the Section 8 stuff, and it's mixing the lower income with the middle income, and it's like, what you did over there was okay, but now you're bringing it over here, and it's just bringing the area down. So data from HUD confirmed Groveland residents' suspicions that the number of families using vouchers had gone up from 58 voucher holders in 1998 to 200 voucher holders in 2009. That's an increase from 2% of all households in 1998 to almost 5% of households in 2009. But most of those new families using housing choice vouchers were not displaced public housing residents, as the CHA data show. So to conclude, what's happening in Groveland is that the fully complex story about federal and local housing policies, the move from public housing to vouchers, the enduring patterns of racial and class segregation, and the widespread fraud and racism in the mortgage market, which created all of these abandoned houses in Groveland, they condensed all of this complicated structural story to a simple and visible target: former public housing families and low-income voucher holders. From this research in Groveland and the other neighborhoods in Chicago, I would argue that the real ugliness that exists out there is in the discourse about displaced public housing families is just a part of the larger stigma that attaches to families with vouchers who never lived in public housing, that attaches to poor residents of non-subsidized housing, and that indeed attaches to the full population of low-income and Black and minority residents generally. The label public housing resident from Chicago, used as a pejorative, even stretches into Iowa and Wisconsin and Minnesota. Indeed, poor and/or Black residents don't even have to move anywhere to experience that stigma, as the residents of the Lathrop homes on the north side are experiencing as the neighborhood changes around them and they stay in place, and as they experience that stigma from the CHA itself. So this is more a story about racism and classism than it is about any understanding or realities about public housing and the former residents who were pushed out when the units were demolished. Many of the working class and Black and Latino and poor families moving to Minneapolis and to Groveland are just looking for better schools and safer streets. So I don't have a solution for the issues that I'm raising. It's quite a downer story, and I should end with a solution, but I think maybe together but I do think that community organizations, block clubs, churches, progressive residents, all of us where we live, could work towards minimizing the unproductive stigmatizing that by actually talking to our neighbors and finding our common ground. And I think the media could be more responsible in its reporting. You'd have this sense that there are 3 million public housing residents in a city of 2.7 million as opposed to 5,000 who are moving with vouchers. And I think at a much bigger level, resources are needed so that even neighborhoods with high proportions of families with vouchers, with high proportions of relocated public housing families, with high proportions of Black folk can thrive. This addresses that threshold effect argument. There should be no threshold of renters, no threshold of families with vouchers, no threshold of Black people, and no threshold of former public housing residents, because after all of those are just categories that are just residents. And if people live there, then they should be served as any other category of resident should be served. Our neighborhoods shouldn't have to gentrify to thrive. We shouldn't have to move to white neighborhoods to thrive, and we shouldn't have to move to the suburbs to thrive. Neighborhoods that definitely have their fair share just need a fair shake in the distribution of goodies in the city and beyond.
Wow, that was wonderful. Our third panelist is Chris Klepper, Executive Director of HCP of Illinois, who will talk about families who relocated to opportunity areas in the Chicago region. In fact, her work with the CHA, her relocation work, was in part related to the results of the study and of the litigation that was based upon the segregative results of the relocation of public housing families in the Plan for Transformation. Chris has been Executive Director of HCP for 20 years. It is one of the longest running mobility programs in the country, and Chris Klepper has 40 years total fair housing and housing counseling management experience. She has designed, implemented, and overseen staffs on all of HCP's direct service mobility projects in a variety of circumstances, including a regional mobility program in the Chicago area and several relocation programs, including the CHA. Ms. Klepper wrote a piece for the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, to give you an idea of where she is coming from, called America's Blind Spot, The Devastating Impact of Residential Segregation. And has spoken at many local and national conferences on fair housing and mobility counseling. Chris?
I want to thank the National Public Housing Museum and the University of Chicago Urban Network for hosting this panel, and it's so great to see so many people who care about this subject. Sometimes we feel quite alone out there, so it's great to have this evening to talk about this topic. I want to tell you a little bit about Housing Choice Partners, the agency that I represent. We're a nonprofit mobility counseling agency growing out of the Gautreaux program. I think most of you know Gautreaux was a lawsuit filed in the mid-'60s by the ACLU against HUD, the city of Chicago, for concentrating African-American public housing in African-American parts of the city only. It was very deliberate, very racist. So that lawsuit was filed, and a mobility program grew out of that litigation. It was called the Gautreaux Assisted Housing Program. I actually worked on that program in the mid-70s, believe it or not, and also the early 90s. So I've really been doing this kind of work, fair housing mobility, for about 40 years, and I have to say progress has been a little slow, but we keep at it. Our mission for our organization is to reduce intergenerational poverty by promoting racial and economic diversity in housing. We know that where one lives, rightfully or not, often determines one's life outcomes. So we're a 20-year-old organization. Mobility, the term refers to expanded housing choice, helping families learn about all the options in the area and making an informed choice about where they want to go. They may be interested in better schools, less crime, more jobs. Whatever their reason, they should have a choice as to where they go, and that's what mobility is all about. We generally work with public housing authorities doing a mobility program, which is really voluntary. Unlike relocation, people had to move, right? Their units were coming down or they were being rehabbed, so families had to make a move, they had to be relocated. That's different than a voluntary mobility program where people have some time to search, to think about where they want to go, to learn about other housing options. But CHA, along with advocates, came up with a sort of a mobility piece to the relocation program itself, and that's the first time those two things came together, so that those undergoing relocation would really have some fair housing choice in where they went. The families that we worked with took a voucher. We worked with about 900 families, and I think there were 4,000 to 5,000 families who ultimately took a voucher from public housing and moved to the private housing market. So we just worked with a small group of that total, and of course, that total is a small part of the total plan for relocation. But that was our role in the project. We also do some regional fair housing work and some consulting. We've done some work with other PHAs in other states, and there's a lot of interest right now with the inequality that everyone has finally been talking about coming more to the forefront. So there's more interest in mobility as a strategy, not for everybody, but for some people who want to move to get into a better school district or an area with greater job opportunities. So what does it mean? I always forget to do that, so I remembered. What does it mean to move to an opportunity area for one of these families? Well, if you look at the statistics, adults tend to have higher household earnings, less anxiety and depression, diabetes and obesity, and better mental health. That was an outcome of what was called the Moving to Opportunity study, and was a surprise, especially the health outcomes. The families that moved from highly concentrated neighborhoods to opportunity areas really improved their health outcomes as well as income that we might have suspected. Boys and girls both ended up with much better health outcomes, higher rates of college enrollment, higher English and math scores, and girls with less risky behavior. So making those opportunity moves from a variety of studies has shown some very positive outcomes. On the other side, what does it mean to stay in a highly toxic neighborhood? And I'm talking about some of the most disinvested communities in Chicago and around the country, and the most highly concentrated. For children that are exposed to violence, there's potential brain development and cognitive learning issues that can last a lifetime. And there can be an impact on life outcomes, including health that I discussed, education, income, and even a shorter lifespan. So families often have to leave their comfort zone for places they aren't familiar with. They often encounter discrimination in their search for housing, and they may leave behind important support systems to get into those better areas. But those support systems may in fact be necessary and may be a reason that they stay right where they are. That's certainly their choice, and we want to be sure that they know what their options are in the end. So some of the services that HCP provided included information at relocation fairs, and I see Francine Washington over there, and I remember her at the Stateway Relocation Fair. We did a lot of door-to-door outreach to engage families, orientations, workshops, one-on-one counseling. We did a lot to identify units in opportunity areas and landlords who would participate in the program. We took families to see units. We assisted with paperwork, with landlord negotiation, and actually closing the deal because there's an inspection and a rent negotiation involved as well. We helped with the move, with the lease and keys. Sometimes our counselors were there actually helping pack boxes. And after the move, we would provide some supportive housing services to the families to help them navigate their new communities, whether they were opportunity or not. This is a map, and this shows all the developments that HCP worked in from 2003 through 2010. From Altgeld Gardens, this is the city, Altgeld Gardens on the south to Pomeroy on the north, LeClaire on the west to Wells and Dearborn on the east. So we served a lot of families. We were usually the last agency that went to the development. We worked with the families who really didn't want to go. Some families did. They wanted that voucher, and they felt they had more of a choice with the voucher. But it was a hard move for a lot of these families, and my staff was at Cabrini Green at 3 a.m. helping the last families move out and move into their new units. So we were on the front lines for sure. The next map I'm going to show you is where families moved when they worked with HCP. So this would have been their move from public housing with a voucher into the private market, their first move. So you can see we had moves out to the suburbs, about, let's see, how many were there? Well, I don't know, I had it here somewhere, but about 60 moves, I think, to about 40 different communities. You can see a lot of people stayed on the south and west sides of Chicago, which was their choice. And, but we did see some dispersion. We saw some moves to the north, we saw some moves to the southwest, and sort of a much broader range of neighborhoods that people lived in than obviously where they began. These are current locations. These were unassisted moves or people who stayed in place. So we moved originally about 900 people. We don't know what happened to about 38% of them, but about 600 families are represented on this map. And you can see they're a little bit more centralized than the previous map I showed you, which was a little bit more diverse. It looks like a little bit more concentrated with unassisted moves, though not a lot. But families did move back to traditional areas for a whole variety of reasons, including the fact that they didn't necessarily have any counseling. So I can't go through all of these numbers, but I can tell you what's important on this slide. And that is, out of our 900 moves, we had about 43% of families that went to opportunity or low poverty neighborhoods, which we thought was fantastic. That's a pretty good number under all the circumstances in the city of Chicago over a long period of time. Families moved from census tracts that averaged almost 60% poverty and moved to tracts that averaged 29% poverty. So that was a pretty significant improvement in poverty rates. They also moved from tracts that averaged 94% African American and moved to tracts averaging 77% African American. So we cut the poverty rate in half. We got people into a little bit more diverse situations, but we didn't have a big change there. Oh, and there it is, the 66 moves to 40 different suburbs. In terms of current locations, I can tell you that only 28% of families are in opportunity or low poverty neighborhoods. So without counseling, our 43% of moves to opportunity low poverty areas went down to 28. And that was without counseling. And so we think counseling makes a difference. Although it's interesting, the census tracts that families ended up in actually went down a little bit in terms of poverty to about 26%. So they started out at almost 60 and are in areas that are 26% poverty, which is still pretty high, but it's a lot better. And then from 94% African American to 66% African American, so more racially diverse over time. What I would say about the process, I think the process overall that the CHA did was good. They worked a lot with advocates. Advocates were meeting with the CHA regularly from 1999 all the way through the process, so that our contract for services included a lot of very good things that needed to be done to help the families. So overall, I thought the process was good. We could have used higher rents, which we have now, longer search times, and more cooperation from the real estate industry, including maybe some incentives for them to try the voucher program. We know that households moved primarily for safety in schools. We did a variety of surveys over the time that we provided services. But we don't really know how families are doing in that regard. We needed more follow-up, more tracking, and maybe recognition of a process that a family, isn't going to make a giant leap from the south side to Kenilworth to get their child into a better performing school. That there's a process and that there's a place where they stop. And I think more follow-up and work with those families would have been important. I think we would have learned a lot. But it's not too late, and I think CHA is thinking about taking a look at these 900 families to see how they're doing. We don't really know how they're doing. We know anecdotally some people are doing fine, some people aren't doing fine, and they want to move again. But we should know. It's important to know. It's especially important to know those who move to opportunity in low poverty neighborhoods. Are they really doing better? And if so, how much better? For those who didn't make a move, have they improved their circumstance? My guess is they have, but is it as much as those who moved to opportunity or low poverty areas? And we don't know the answer to that, at least in the CHA's 900 HCP family population. But I'm going to leave you with a very positive note. It's something you can find on our website. Our website is www.hcp-chicago spelled out.org, and you can link. Whoops, sorry, I forgot this. You can click on this link to a story that was done on National Public Radio, WBEZ's Marketplace. The article starts at HCP's orientation for participants of the mobility program and ends with a story about a CHA resident who moved to an opportunity area in 2005, and now her daughter's graduating from college with a double major. And I might also say she's not on the voucher program anymore. I can't hire her. She makes more money than I can pay her. Her name is Saida Harris, and she wanted something better for her kids, and she did it, and she's a true success story, I think. So I'll leave you with that, and hopefully I can come back and tell you a little bit more about how all these families ultimately did with their move. Thank you.
Okay, our fourth panelist is Crystal Palmer, who will discuss the situation of families living in rehab traditional public housing. Crystal Palmer, a former public housing resident, serves as the Chicago Housing Authority's liaison to the Resident Central Advisory Council and the ombudsman for the residents that now live in the new mixed-income communities. Before joining the CHA staff, Ms. Palmer was herself a member of that council as president of the Henry Horner Homes West Haven Local Advisory Council. She has worked as a case manager for the Horner Engagement Program, providing social services to public housing residents. Ms. Palmer has received a number of awards, among them being named one of the 10 most influential women on the West Side. Fantastic. A community hero by LISC Chicago and BPI's Champion of the Public Interest 2014. Ms. Palmer also serves as vice chair of the National Public Housing Museum's Board of Directors. Crystal.
Thank you. That was a warm welcome. Okay. Wow. It seems like I've been in all areas. All areas, a resident, employee, provider, museum, vice chair. I've done a lot of things. So I do know a little bit about what's going on with the families of public housing. We'll start off with, after the plan, traditional public housing. Today I'll talk to you about CHA's traditional family housing portfolio, how it has changed through the plan of transformation. I'll briefly describe the quality of housing stock, resident safety and security, access to resident services, policies for admissions and occupancy, and tenant representation. I'll also provide you with a snapshot of our current household in our traditional sites. All right. CHA currently has 13 traditional families portfolios, which has a total of about 7,000 units. These are all 100% public housing units, which serve all 100% of public housing residents. There are some sites in this portfolio that are still under rehabilitation and under mixed income redevelopment, such as Argyle Gardens, Cabrini Row Houses, Lathrop Homes, and I think we left out Horner Superblock. Before the plan, there were more than 25 family sites, including the high-rises and other sites that have been since demolished. The quality of, I'm sorry, I forget to click too. Improving Housing quality. The quality of the housing stock has improved significantly since the plan. Before the plan, one would say, if you were in my neighborhood and you went down in Horner, you would say it was blighted, because at some point in time, I remember during the National Democratic Convention, they had to put like boards in the windows, make it look like flower boards in the window to make it look attractive. They were also in deplorable conditions. The elevators were broken, the heat didn't work correctly, you're seeing urine, feces, a lot of drug activities, gangs were in the building. So there were a lot of bad conditions that were going on at that time. Now, since the plan, there have been some major things that have happened, renovations that have went on in our developments. If you go to Dearborn, let's just use Dearborn, you will see that the whole face has changed on Dearborn. You will see that you will know that they have new electrical systems. They will have new mechanics in the buildings. You will see that there are nice parking lots that are all lit all up. There are play areas for the youth to play at. There are also other recreational areas within the buildings for residents to use. Also, they have new air condition, new heating systems, and they are also upgraded the interior and the exterior of ADA units. Okay. Safety and security. Yes, safety and security. There have been really some dramatic changes that have happened. Again, if you were at any development before the plan, you would have seen very hostile environments. You would have seen that gangs had taken over those communities. And where I lived, they locked the buildings down, and you had to have access to actually get in and out of the building. And before that time, there used to be the police department on site. At East Development, there used to be an ambulance on site at East Development. And the reason why those things happened is because we weren't considered residents of the city. We really weren't. The police departments, if you called and said, send me a police to this address, they wouldn't likely come. If there was a fire in the building, there were fire hoses up on each floor. They were broken. So when the fire department came, they couldn't get any water. I've seen people actually jump from the 14th floor window because of a fire in the house where they couldn't get into, get the water from the hallway to the building. So they weren't unsafe. They were unsafe. Now, there's a lot of things that have changed in our community. We have 24-hour security cameras that are being monitored by our emergency service department, that we monitor them at CHA. We have security on site. Some sites have 24-hour security. Some sites have security maybe 16 hours a day. We also host security meetings with residents, LAC, property manager, just to discuss the issues that are going on in the area and how we can help combat that. We also, in the summertime, or if there's a hot development, we also have special initiatives, employment police that come out and monitor the sites very closely to try to curtail some of the violence in the community. All right. Access to services have improved significantly since CHA, since the plan. Again, I would say that before the plan, I think I read in the 2000 plan that we were not privy to city services, which made me feel that I was a refugee in the city of Chicago, that I can touch downtown with my hand, but I couldn't take advantage of those services. Even if you went to try to get a job and you were in public housing and your address came up, you were kind of stigmatized from that. Now, we have Family Works on site. We've contracted with Family Works to provide services for our residents, which they help them with employment. They provide youth services. They provide services for seniors, so seniors won't be locked in their house all the time, that they engage with them. We also engage with the city of Chicago, where our youth and our seniors take advantage of some of the city programs, the workforce development programs that they have at the city. And also, we give out vouchers to our children, the ages 6 to 12, so they can go to the park district and not be at home all day while their mom at work or their father at work trying to provide for them. They can also go to the park district and take advantage of some of those services year-round. One other change that has happened is our administration and occupancy policies. In 2009, our minimum rent changed. It used to be $25 was the minimum rent, but it changed in 2009 to $75 for public housing residents and HCV families. Also in 2009, CHA implemented the public housing work requirement, which means that a person 18 years to 54 years old would have to be involved in some kind of work, volunteer, training or something to move themselves towards self-sufficiency. And even for those youth that are 17 years of age that are not in school full-time. This work requirement will give them employment. You can go to school. It would also provide them with case management for issues that they may be having, getting a job, keeping a job. So Family Works is a good thing for our residents to help move them towards self-sufficiency through this work requirement. Tenant representation. Can I get the CAC to stand up for a minute, please? I always like to acknowledge them. Because of the work that they do, they are duly elected, meaning they are elected just like the President of the United States, the governor, the senator, but they are elected by the residents of our traditional developments. They speak on behalf of the residents. They negotiate with CHA. They have a back and forth with CHA about issues, things that they think the families need. And I can say for myself that they are highly respected through CHA and across the country because they travel a lot of places telling the stories that they have. And lastly, our demographics. So here's a look at the traditional family household compared to our mixed income households. In general, households are not very different across the portfolio. The employment rate and average income is slightly higher for mixed income families, and that could be because of the work requirement. Those families in traditional, again, have a minimum of 20 hours, and those in mixed have a minimum of 30 hours of work requirement, which means that in order to pay $75 in rent, to pay your light, gas, and all the other things that it costs to keep your household afloat, it costs you to get a job, which is a great thing that we have our Family Works here that will actually help our families to meet those goals. Thank you. One more comment before I leave. We talk about after the plan. I want to say to you that the plan has not ended. The plan still continues on because we continue to work with the families, reach out to those families that we're trying to relocate. We're still reaching out to them every single day. So until the last person is housed, the plan won't be over. So the plan continues. It's not after the plan. It's a continuation of the plan. Sorry.
Thank you. Amy, you talked about the challenges of these mixed income developments, of creating, quote, community. How can these interactions be improved within these mixed income developments?
Is this on? Okay, great. So there's a couple of strategies. One is undertaking right now with the Brenshaw Michaels team at 2 of their developments. They have resident coordinators that are there both as prevention support but also intervention, really to help facilitate and support the residents across different tenure groups. So I think they have developed a very strong model and would recommend you looking into it if you're interested. Secondly, the working groups used to function as a strong governance opportunity for residents to have a voice in shaping both the design and the planning and the implementation. In some places, those working groups have stopped functioning. And so I would strongly suggest that the CHA and their partners reinstate opportunities for monthly conversations that can happen both across residents and stakeholders, and also become more inclusive to have more residents who are currently living in that community be a part of those working groups. And finally, the idea of inclusion across and outside of the mixed income communities remains very important, so that the CHA stigma that Mary talked about doesn't get articulated to the mixed income developments, that we don't start thinking about mixed income developments like we used to think about public housing developments. And so how can we find ways to ensure that there are bridge building opportunities? And I think that has happened particularly at the Oakwood Shores community, where they've done an incredible job of working with the neighborhood schools, the recreation community, and other kinds of public partners, as well as nonprofit partners, to ensure that residents are having an opportunity to participate outside of their own physical neighborhood of the mixed income.
Thank you. Next question. And this is for Chris, has the Gautreaux case outlived its usefulness as it relates to the plan for transformation?
Well, the plan for transformation, in a sense, has moved a lot of the voucher holders that it was going to move, but it's not done with development. We still have families out there with vouchers who can move every year. So I guess I would say no. I don't think Gautreaux is sort of passé. I think it's still an important part of CHA and how it delivers choices to its families. So there's the development aspect, the mixed income aspect, and the voucher aspect. And I think families deserve a choice no matter sort of which road they're going down. Not all development should be in higher poverty, racially segregated neighborhoods. They should be all over the city. They should be in places where there are good schools. Although we should have good schools in every neighborhood, shouldn't we? But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. So I think in terms of voucher holders, as I said during my presentation, without counseling, families tend to go back to the traditional neighborhoods because that's what they know. It's harder to go to a neighborhood you're not familiar with. How do you even learn about what the options are? And having somebody help you do that, I think, is important. So providing those services going forward for voucher holders is important. Mixed income developments are critical, I think, and And at some point, we need to talk about racially diverse developments, not just mixed income. There's a book called Stuck in Place by Patrick Sharkey that is really excellent and not horribly hard reading about intergenerational poverty and sort of immigrants coming into our cities and what an opportunity that is to help bridge the divide between black and white. And that needs to happen throughout our cities. So I'd say, Gautreaux is still a very important part, not just of the plan for transformation, but of any housing program anywhere in the country.
Thank you. Next question. I've heard that part of the issue we're experiencing with crime and gangs on the south and west sides of the city is the result of the destruction of the high-rise public housing. Mary, you want to maybe comment on that?
Definitely not the case. Gangs and crime existed on the south and west sides and in other parts of the city well before the plan for transformation. I'm no historian, but of course, Mayor Richard J, alphabetical order. Richard J. Daley, there were gangs in Bridgeport, and so gangs definitely predate public housing, definitely predate the demolition of public housing. So the kinds of research that I mentioned about the increases in crime, supposed increases in crime when public housing residents move in, it's what the evidence shows is that crime was going down in Chicago neighborhoods and went down in neighborhoods even when public housing residents moved in, with the exception perhaps of neighborhoods where a high concentration of former public housing residents moved in. Those places also saw decreases in crime, but slower decreases than other neighborhoods. And my general point about that kind of research and the threshold effect research generally is part of the problem is that we haven't had services follow residents where they've moved. So we need to think about crime as an economic symptom, a symptom of poverty, a symptom of joblessness, a symptom of poor schools, a symptom of no after-school programs, a symptoms of unsupported parks. And if we have resources flow to those neighborhoods, it's not a threshold of too many voucher holders that creates crime. It's the lack of those kinds of alternatives that leads people to crime.
Thank you. Next question. Why is the mayor so behind in replacement housing? I guess another way of saying it is, why has the plan for transformation slowed down so much to almost where there's almost no activity going on? Amy, do you want to
Sure. I think the slowdown did start happening around 2009 to 2010. So it does predate the mayor, but starting when his term started in 2011 and on kind of his run for mayor and onward, we've definitely seen a shrinking interest politically. There used to be civic capacity that was at the head of Daley's agenda, and now it's really become Daley's dream, Mayor Emanuel's nightmare, and that his turning the back away from housing and community development. The same time that happened, we saw Habitat, which was a strong partner with CHA and managed a lot of the redevelopment project. They had a federal court told them to back down and back off. And so without their capacity, CHA suffered because they didn't have the time to really build their internal energy to be able to do the kind of redevelopment that was needed. And then finally, we've seen, I believe, 7 CEOs in the last 8 years. And so without the kind of stability internally, it's led CHA team members and residents to not know who to turn to. I just want to mention real quick one last story. The current CEO, Gene Jones, I attended a meeting several months ago with him. He ended the meeting with turning off the tape, the official recording, which is required by law, and said, now the real meeting's gonna start. So now that the real meeting's happening, we can throw away the rules a bit and shake things up. And so residents could go directly to him and claim their issues, being, whether it was snow or windows or whatever, and he gave them his direct cell phone number and promised to follow up on their concern. Now, is this a good thing? Do we want the CHA playing that role? Or is it incumbent on the private sector landlord to be the one to take those claims and to address those issues? I think that's still out for debate.
Crystal, have the leasing, have the requirements for being in traditional public housing, the leasing requirements changed from the way they were before the high-rises were torn down?
I would say probably yes. There is a work requirement now.
Anything beyond the work requirement?
No, I think there may be a preference for employed people, but you can move in without, but you should be looking for something. And that's why we have those programs from Family Works that help families to find employment. So a lot of barriers can be broken, because these services and these programs are out there for them.
Right. Is it more, again, a related question, is it more difficult for off-lease people to be in traditional public housing than it was before the high-rises were torn down, do you think?
I think it's a wait list. You have to go through the wait list the same way you did when the high-rises was up.
This is a question for Chris and Mary. Chris has worked on regional mobility programs. Have either of you seen attitudes shift in the past 5 to 8 years regarding the fair share idea? Are communities better informed about how many vouchers they have and how many other areas have? Are opportunity areas more open to vouchers?
I think this relates to the earlier question about this not being on the front burner of Mayor Emanuel or many not being on the front burner kind of in Chicago politics. And of course, right now with the issues around police brutality and police violence, it's understandable. There are lots of issues that could be on the front burner. But I think it's related in that I don't think there's been positive or negative work to improve the situation in receiving neighborhoods, to either do the work that I mentioned about making them more welcoming, or any particular increase in rejection of families moving in. I think also, as I mentioned, we're at about almost 5,000 former public housing families with vouchers. We saw the increase in housing choice voucher, the numbers in Chicago kind of already from the early years of the plan to now, and given federal funding and budget cuts and so on, I doubt that we'll see any further increase in general voucher holders, and so the numbers are unlikely to go up much. So I think it's kind of at a standstill. I don't think there's either positive or negative change.
I would say in terms of the voucher, it's sort of more invisible. It's much easier for one family to move to an opportunity neighborhood than it is to build a development in an opportunity neighborhood, right? Where the community opposition gets going. Just read about Rockford or Fresno, California. So mobility in the voucher program it's a good way to get families into better neighborhoods. That's not to say they don't experience discrimination, because they do in their housing search. We've done a lot of source of income complaints because landlords just say we're not going to rent to a voucher holder in spite of a law that says they can't do that. And of course, I'm not black, but everyday discrimination that people run into. But I think a lot of our families are okay to deal with some of that because they're getting their kids into a place where they can play outside and they don't have to worry about their safety. That is like the number one thing that we hear. And I would say I don't see community opposition as a as a big issue with regard to the voucher program. I do in terms of development, even though that's improved regionally through some very smart strategies, sort of getting the mayors, for example, in suburban communities to all agree to housing endorsement criteria so that each development, you know, if it's near transportation, it's well-built, it's well-designed, blah, 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 it gets approval without the kind of community opposition that we've seen in Chicago before and in other places. So in some ways, I think it is getting better. I think as our population, again, as I said, more immigrants, I think it helps the situation, but it's not to say that it's an easy thing to do. We don't have enough units in opportunity areas. They're still too expensive. It's not fair that all the good schools are in these particular areas, and it's so hard for our families to reach them. But I have seen improvement when I look back over my 40 years, so it's very slow going, I guess.
One last question. Since 2000, the black child population has declined dramatically in both Chicago and the state as a whole. Yet child poverty rates have increased, especially for black children. Concentrated poverty has also increased over the past 15 years. What are the implications of these trends for assessing the effects of the plan for transformation? I'll open that up to anyone.
Whoever wrote that is already a researcher and has probably written a paper on the topic, given that density of information. So that's not fair. They should get the mic. I will say, did you say the first statistic was the
Yes.
the black child population has declined? Right. So I will say that, so not just the black child population, the black population. From 2000 to 2010, the black population in Chicago declined by about 187,000 residents. As a black person in Chicago who likes my black neighborhood, I was very sad to know that by about 2013, the black population ceased to be the plurality. It was not the majority. It was like, you know, Chicago's about a third black, a third Latino, a third white, and the white population inched above the black population in terms of being a plurality, like 36% to 35%, I don't remember the exact numbers. But Chicago's black population is declining, and I think this is connected to the plan for transformation, the displacement of public housing residents and their children. But I also think the closing of schools, these are all related. The closing of schools, the destabilization of neighborhoods by the unequal disbursement of public housing residents, as ugly and stigmatizing as the language that I shared with you all today is, it nonetheless exists in the neighborhood and causes people to move, that kind of black flight that the person I mentioned talked about. And to be honest, from an urban planner's perspective, I don't really get the mayor's or the planners' desire to move black folks out. Now, I do get their desire, unfortunately, from a planner's perspective, to move poor people out, because planners are about increasing tax revenues, increasing property taxes, increasing sales taxes, increasing contributions to political campaigns, all of these things that richer people do better than poorer people. But there's a lot of black middle-class folks on the south and west sides who are also being displaced by closing schools, whose lives are being destabilized by the various kinds of interventions that are happening in the city. And that's where you see the 187,000 people decline from 2000 to 2010, which puts Chicago at the bottom of the list in terms of city population growth among big cities. New York is growing, LA is growing, Houston is soon gonna outpace us as the third largest city. These are none of the things that any good Chicago politician should want, and so I don't quite understand, those kinds of policies. So that's a longer answer, I think, than just the impact of the plan for transformation.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I'm going to just jump in real quick. I think what we see here is spatial solutions to social and economic structural issues. And so if we're approaching this, as we have for the last 80 years of housing and urban development policy from a standpoint of investing in the built environment and believing somehow that if we are shifting the physical space and shifting the way people therefore live in that space, that somehow that's going to get at the root of poverty, then I think we can look at our history and see that that's just not going to work. And we need to be looking at different kinds of policy solutions that really focus much more on a broader agenda of universal types of assistance and support that right now, I mean, even only looking at housing, we're only talking right now about low-income affordable housing. Well, the real benefits, the real subsidies that are going towards the property mortgage interest tax deduction and the low-income housing tax credits, those are creating more economic inequality rather than actually helping advance justice and equality. So I would say that we need to think much more broadly about moving from spatial solutions to a different way of approaching our federal and our state and local policies.
I'm just going to jump in for a minute since I am sort of a spatial person, I guess. I mean, we're talking about institutional racism here. I mean, that's what this is all about. Families that don't have a choice, that live in disinvested places. And sometimes a mom with a 6-year-old kid doesn't have time, to get those place-based strategies to work. And so for some people, I think making a move makes sense. For other people, it doesn't. But the whole point is folks should have a choice. And if we had a more integrated environment, it doesn't have to be one number or another number, but a more integrated and free housing market instead of the dual housing market that we have, we wouldn't have to talk about mobility, but we do, because we are living in a highly segregated housing market and city where the resources are all grabbed up by the wealthy and the poor are left out. And that's, we've tried place-based strategies for years and years and years and years and years. And I'm not saying we should stop doing that, but I also think we need to start looking at integrating some of these neighborhoods. It's not just a matter of black people moving to white neighborhoods, it's a matter of white people moving to black neighborhoods too. And if we didn't have this dual housing market, that would happen. If we didn't have institutional racism governing everything, we wouldn't have to talk about these kind of strategies, but we do. So I'm sticking with my spatial strategy, at least for the time being. Right, and that's often what we end up with. It's either or. It's not either or. We need all hands on deck here. And every time you talk about mobility, the place-based people start thinking, oh no, we don't want to invest anymore. No, we need everything, because what we're doing is not getting the job done.
Thank you. Thank you, panel. I think it was very interesting, and hope you enjoyed it.